Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to be here in this great conference, and thanks for the organizers. And it's a privilege to be sharing the podium with such distinguished colleagues. When I came into the door, I was told by our chairman that I have to have 4 to 5 minutes opening remarks. And I took out the notes from my briefcase, and I saw that my secretary told me that she was told that I have 45 minutes. So as a result of the negotiations, we ended up with 6. I probably will take less. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been focusing a lot on the euro. I was walking in New York recently, and I stopped 2 people, and I said, "What is on your mind?" The first one was, who will be the next president? The second one was, we have such a great embarrassment with the inability of Congress to come with a sensible budget deal. Well, I thought this was the part of the world. And I went to Thailand, and I was told, what is on your mind? Well, how to deal with the floods. And I went to Japan. What is on your mind? How to continue the recovery from the earthquake. And I went to Europe, and what's on your mind? Of course, Europe. So the first point that I want to make is, Europe, of course, is the central economic challenge, economic political challenge today, but there are many other parts of the world, and we will hear later on in the session about the emerging markets by our good friend Kishore from Singapore. But you ask me about the world. I don't believe that the United States is going into a double dip. A year ago, the main debate was, is it going to be a double dip? I believe that all the projections are now that the US this year will grow at about 1.8%, next year at about 1.8%. It's nothing to write home about, it's not great, but it's not a disaster. The reason for the sluggish growth, there is a consensus, lack of clarity. Lack of clarity about the political prospects, lack of clarity about the regulatory prospects, lack of clarity about the fiscal monetary prospects. But having said this, that's the story of the United States. The reason why I start from the United States is that when all is said and done, it is still the largest, strongest economy in the world. Second, Latin America. You know, I was in Latin America recently, and everyone started his speech by saying, this time it's not us. And indeed, they were used to have all the crises starting there. This time, it's not them. Latin America will continue to grow at about 2.5%, with some diversity. Some nations are growing faster. And here, as a side remark, one of the reasons why Latin America and Southeast Asia have been spared from some of the challenges that are now facing Europe and the United States is that they were lucky to have their crisis earlier. And indeed, if it was not for the crisis of the Latin Americans earlier on, of Southeast Asia in the 90s, probably we would not have had such robust reserves in the central banks and the like. So having said this, even Japan next year is going to grow at about 2%. So the real challenge is really Europe. Because when we look at Asia, Asia ex-Japan will continue to grow, and they will grow at about 6%, a little less than last year. China will grow at around 8%, a little less than last year, but still, Asia is going to continue to be an important engine of economic growth. So to wrap up this, we have a fundamental challenge in Europe. In the US, we still have a significant issue. And in the global arena, let me say that one of the issues that has not been addressed in the past decade has been the issue of imbalances in the current accounts of the balance of payments. For a full decade, the United States has had large deficits in the current account of the balance of payments. It spent more than its income. It was financed by large surpluses, especially in Asia, especially in China, but also from the Middle East, Russia, associated with oil. That structural issue meant that the center of gravity in the world has been moving. And in fact, if you look at, I have a friend, by the way, from the planet Mars. He's visiting us every 20 years. When he was here in 1990, and he wanted to look at the panorama of the world, it was enough for him to look at US, Europe, Japan, and he already got 66% of world output. When he came this year, he saw that the very same three countries produce 45% of world output. Where did it all go? Well, in his previous visit, China and India together produced 7% of world output. Today, 20% of world output. Huge change. And of course, this meant a lot of changes in the competitive sphere, and indeed, both exporters from the United States and from Europe have felt the competitive pressures from China. But when all is said and done, entrepreneurs in the US and in Europe have seized the opportunities that China has provided. In fact, in the year 2000, of all the exports of Europe, only 5% went to China. 1 decade later, today, 21% of European exports go to China. Similar story in the United States. It was just 5% and again, 24% today. Put it differently, the center of gravity of the world has changed. The trading spheres have changed. People feel that there is a change in the distribution of wealth, in the distribution of income. It produces significant social pressures, which we are familiar from all over the world, and the world will not be the same the morning after. But still, there are some new governance rules that are required in order to recognize and validate those economic changes. And we will discuss it as we go along. But for example, in the international bodies, in the IMF, it makes no sense that Asia will have such a low level of representation relatively to its share. It makes no sense, and excuse me, I'm in Europe, but that Europe will have such a large representation. Exactly because of the fact it's not whom you like and whom you respect, but rather the center of power in the world has changed, and it has to be validated and reflected in the governance of the world. We still have fundamental changes. If you look in the United States, only 10% of each dollar is saved. If you look in China, 50% of each dollar is saved. Well, it's not a surprise that a country that is saving a lot is accumulating assets, and a country that saves a lot is decumulating assets. So don't say, surprise, surprise, we have larger debt of the United States. Go back to square one and say, why is it the case that China is saving so high? Why is it the case that the United States is spending so much? And when you look at it in this way, you recognize that if the Chinese tell you, we have to save because we cannot rely on the next generation, because we have a one-child family, we do not have social security system, we do not have a pension system, well, we don't have capital markets, and therefore our companies do not distribute dividends, therefore they need to save. When you put it all together, it means a strategy for structural change to bring about a different gap in the savings, which will then reflect itself in different gaps in current account. Let me stop here, but I would hope that we will have a moment later to come back to Europe, because that's really where one has a lot to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frenkel, and we will definitely have time to come back to Europe. You gave, on the whole, a rather optimistic overview of the whole world economy. Maybe on one other point later on, but also for Dr. Ilsa Kong and Lourdes Arandia, there's one part of all this, the employment situation, which really is getting worse and worse, has not improved, is not even improving in most of the countries that are like in the US and many other countries, even among the emerging markets. So I would want to kind of stress that apart from GDP, you know, the employment objective is another one that I think the G20 worries about, the G8 worries about.